Okay, picture this. It's the pre-dawn hours of a January morning in 2026, and the Western Hemisphere is about to get hit by a geopolitical earthquake. A direct, bold military action that, honestly, very few saw coming. This is the story of Operation Absolute Resolve.
The first sign that something was deeply wrong were the sounds. Imagine waking up to the deafening roar of low-flying aircraft, and then a series of explosions that literally shake the ground. All across Caracas, smoke is starting to plume into the morning sky as helicopters just swarm overhead. A capital city was under siege.
The world didn't have to wait long for answers, though. Just a few hours later, the White House steps up to the podium and claims responsibility. President Donald Trump, in a pretty brief statement, announces a huge U.S. strike against Venezuela, and he declares the mission a successful capture.
So let's break down the facts here. The operation was incredibly swift and decisive. U.S. Special Forces, working with CIA intelligence, stormed the presidential compound. They captured not just Nicolás Maduro, but his wife, Cilia Flores, too. From there, they were immediately airlifted to New York to face narco-terrorism charges. Now, the raid was precise but not bloodless. There were over 40 casualties on the ground, including, interestingly, a lot of Cuban military personnel. But here's the kicker: 0 U.S. losses. And in that power vacuum, Vice President Delcy was quickly sworn in as the interim leader.
So let's be clear, this wasn't just some quiet arrest. It was a massive demonstration of overwhelming military force. There were targeted bombings on strategic sites all around Caracas, and that sent a message that was impossible to miss. It was designed to paralyze any resistance before it could even get started.
But how on earth did it come to this? I mean, an operation on this scale doesn't just happen overnight. It was really the explosive finale to years of tension and a pressure campaign that had been ramping up for months.
So, the official story from Washington. Well, they framed it as a massive law enforcement action. For months, the U.S. had been building this case, calling Maduro's government a narco-state. They even designated powerful groups like the Cartel de los Soles as foreign terrorist organizations. So the argument was that the raid was a necessary step to, dismantle a network that was flooding the U.S. with cocaine and bring some major fugitives to justice.
But, as you can imagine, beneath that official story, there were some powerful strategic interests at play. Venezuela's oil reserves are gigantic, some of the largest in the world, and that was a clear prize. U.S. leadership had been openly talking about rebuilding the country's energy sector. And the intervention was also a pretty decisive move to push back against the growing influence of rivals like Russia, China, and Iran, who had all gotten pretty cozy with Maduro's regime.
And you can just see the steady drumbeat of escalation leading up to this. Back in August 2025, a secret directive gave the green light for military force. By September, U.S. forces were already hitting boats in the Caribbean. Then in November, the USS Gerald R, a massive aircraft carrier strike group, shows up in the region. And just weeks before the raid, a de facto naval blockade was put on Venezuelan oil tankers. The stage was absolutely set.
Okay, so the U.S. made its move. The big question now was, how would the rest of the world react? And the answer, well, it was deeply, deeply divided. The global reaction was immediate, and you can see just how split it was. A clear majority, 60% of nations, condemned the intervention, calling it a violation of international law. Only a tiny fraction, just 15%, were fully supportive. Everyone else was kind of stuck in the middle, cautiously calling for stability.
And those diplomatic shockwaves rippled everywhere. In Latin America, major players like Brazil and Mexico called it a dangerous breach of national sovereignty. Of course, Russia, China, and Iran jumped on the opportunity to frame it as aggressive American expansionism. And over at the United Nations, an Emergency Security Council meeting just descended into this huge, heated debate. Legal experts were arguing that the whole thing violated the very core of the UN Charter and set a really perilous new precedent.
So while the world was debating the legality and morality of all this, a really critical question was being asked inside Venezuela itself. Why did the nation's powerful military, which on paper looked like a pretty formidable force, offer so little resistance?
It's honestly one of the most puzzling parts of this whole thing. How does an army with over 100,000 soldiers, with hundreds of combat aircraft and tanks, just stand down when they're being attacked?
Well, the answer really lies in this massive gap between perception and reality. Years of a crippling economic crisis, just rampant mismanagement, and deep, deep corruption had completely hollowed out the Venezuelan armed forces. All their once mighty hardware was aging, it was poorly maintained, and their combat readiness was at an all-time low. It turns out the Venezuelan military was basically a paper tiger.
But it was more than just failing equipment. As this expert, Jesus Renzulo, explains, the military's loyalty wasn't really to the nation of Venezuela, it was to the ruling party, to the corrupt system that made the top brass rich. Their allegiance, it wasn't bought with patriotism, it was bought with a toxic mix of graft and the constant threat from the regime's own internal intelligence services.
Now, to fully get the power dynamics here, you have to understand another key player, the colectivos. These are heavily armed pro-regime paramilitary groups. They operate outside the official military command, and they act as the elite's brutal enforcers on the street.
And this created a really complex and honestly tense internal security structure. The colectivos were essential for putting down protests and intimidating the population, but because they were independent, it often led to friction with the formal military. It was this fragile, weird alliance held together by one single goal, keeping the regime alive.
So, with Maduro gone and a new interim government trying to find its footing, Venezuela is standing at a really perilous crossroads. The future is anything but certain, and the risk of just descending into more chaos is huge.
The fallout from this intervention creates a whole series of risk zones that are all connected. In Latin America, the immediate threats are a potential surge in refugees and the rise of a pro-Maduro insurgency. On the world stage, this just pours gasoline on the fire of the rivalry between the US, Russia, and China. It also sets a dangerous precedent for international law. And, it could totally reshape global energy markets if Venezuelan oil ever fully comes back online. Looking ahead, experts basically see three ways this could all play out. The best case scenario is a fragile stabilization, right? A new government brings some order and starts the long process of rebuilding. A much more dangerous path is prolonged instability, where the country just fractures and falls into a state of civil war. And the third outcome, which has huge global implications, is polarization, where Venezuela becomes the central battleground for a new great power confrontation. Ultimately, what happened in Venezuela raises this profound question that echoes way beyond its borders. By framing direct military action as a law enforcement operation against narco-terrorism, has the United States basically created a new playbook for 21st century intervention? And if the answer is yes, the whole world is left to wonder, who might be next?